Welcome to All Things Breastfeeding, where we discuss happenings in the breastfeeding world. I'm Barbara Robertson, owner of Breastfeeding Center of Ann Arbor and Lacto Learning and a private practice IBCLC. And I'm joined by Jessica.
I'm Jessica, an IBCLC as well.
All right. Well, so this is a topic that Jessica wanted to talk about. So Jessica, what are we talking about today?
Yeah, so I wanted to do an informational episode on all about formula feeding
Okay.
and how to use formula in the healthiest way possible, essentially.
I think that people think because we're IBCLCs, we are like against formula.
Right. I know. We are
Yeah.
not.
No, we're not. We honestly are the first rule of lactation is feed the baby.
Yep.
And so if we do not have enough of a parent's milk, we have to think about what else are we going to feed the baby? Because a well-fed baby feeds best. And that's just our primary goal.
Mhm.
But what are some of the things? Because I think that when we're breastfeeding, people give us all kinds of like rules and like, oh, be careful about this, careful about this. But if we're formula feeding, I feel like we're kind of just thrown to the wolves. People
Right.
don't get a lot of information
Yeah,
about
exactly.
what should be going on. So, what are some of the important things you think should be shared with families
Yeah, I
about how
think
to do this in a healthy way?
Yeah, so I think exactly, because I think there isn't a ton of info on things like, what are the amounts I'm supposed to be giving? How am I supposed to be doing this, in terms of like bottle feeding technique? How do I keep everything clean and sanitized and, all this kind of stuff. So we're going to get into, those kind of details and what we want to share on that. I did want to, real quick touch on again what something you just said, Barbara, or related to that is that I feel like a lot of times when we are working with families using formula, often we're seeing families that they weren't planning on using formula. They would have liked to be, 100% breast milk. And it might be a, unwelcome surprise to them that the baby hasn't been gaining enough weight or, something's going on. It might, we might be dealing with low supply. And again, yeah, I feel like there's this thing in the culture or society of once you start using formula, your breastfeeding journey is on its way out.
Mhm.
Like
Right.
it's
It's
either
all
or.
or nothing.
Exactly.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
how we think of it is, exactly like you said, if we need formula, if we need something to fill that gap while we're working on bringing the supply back up, if that's what the
Mhm.
family wants to do, formula is what many, many, many families are going to use, and that is fine. But the emotions of, those kind of cases of I didn't
Mhm.
want to use formula and now I am can just feel so devastating.
Yeah.
It feels like this big step, right? This big bridge we're crossing that we didn't mean to
Yeah.
cross. I mean, I don't know, if you want to speak to that, Barbara, with some things you kind of tell families. One thing I remind families a lot is, just because we're using some formula, the formula doesn't negate the benefits
Mhm.
of breast milk. Like the
Right.
benefits of breast milk are all still there, even if some formula is being used too. So I don't know if you have anything like that,
Yeah.
Barbara, to like add to that.
I I talk about using formula as a transitional tool.
Yes. Yeah.
I think that that language is again a hopeful language. And it could be that we need to use that transitional tool permanently,
Yeah.
but we
Long
don't
term.
know,
Right.
especially when we first get together. And many people choose to formula feed, and
Hmm.
that is fine too,
Absolutely.
right? People get to make their own decisions for their infant feeding for their babies.
Hmm.
But I do think that even a little bit of breast milk has health benefits
Yeah.
that we undervalue
Yeah.
in our culture.
Yeah.
And again, there's this balance of between, well, what cost does it take you to get that milk? And
Yes.
families need to decide about, their work what their ability to put in the work, and it depends on their family situation and many other factors. But our job is to lay out options, and
Yes.
then their job is to decide what works best for their family
Right.
and to
Exactly.
support them however they need to be
Yeah.
supported.
Yeah. Yeah. So there are many options, and it doesn't mean just because you're using formula, it doesn't mean that needs to replace breastfeeding.
Yeah.
completely if you don't want it to. It's not like the beginning of the end, of breastfeeding. So whether you're someone who wanted to use formula or didn't, and even if you choose to and want to, we are very much supportive of you too. So we wanted to, create some of these. Again, let's go into like how to use formula in the healthiest way possible, whatever the scenario is, that you're using.
So one of the things that shocks me is that people think that paced bottle feeding is only for like preterm babies
Mm,
or for babies who maybe you're trying to get back to the breast.
yeah.
But
Yep.
talk to us about paced bottle feeding and the
Yeah.
importance of it.
Yes. So pace bottle feeding is for everybody, every
Yes.
baby, every age, no matter what's in that bottle, no matter if that baby is never going to nurse, never going to feed at the breast. Like that's not, pace bottle feeding does support breastfeeding, but it's not just for breastfeeding or hope to be breastfeeding babies. It's for all babies because it helps with keeping their feed amounts appropriate, which we'll talk about. What are those amounts? And it helps to make sure those feeds are taking the appropriate amount of time, that they're not being fed too fast. Because if a baby is getting, bottles tipped all the way up, gravity is pushing everything, to the fluid to the baby, they are going to be finishing that bottle a lot quicker. They're going to be intaking a lot more air. They're going to have upset stomachs, which is probably going to affect sleep and probably going to affect fussiness, right? Like it's in everybody's best interest to have a slower, more biologically appropriate feed pace. That's why it's called paced feeding, and amounts as well too.
Yeah, paced bottle feeding promotes healthy eating. And if you think about, we're teaching our babies lifelong habits for how they're going to eat for the rest of their lives.
Right.
What
We're
do we
setting
want to teach
those, the
them? Yeah, those
initial
standards.
foundation of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So we want to teach babies to eat slowly and thoughtfully. We also want the feed to take long enough that the chemicals that tell us that we're full have time to go from our gut to our brain. What are those called? I can't even.
Leptin, right?
Leptin. Yes, leptin's one of them. But those satiation cues take a while. And if we're chugging down 4 to 6 ounces, which is a lot of milk, in 5 to 10 minutes, I can just picture how that person's going to be eating as an adult. And of course, not everybody, but are we?
Riskier. It's risky to be doing that.
Yeah, yeah. And we know that childhood obesity is associated with bottle feeding. And so how we bottle feed is important.
Right.
And we should be keeping those bottles to healthy amounts. So paced bottle feeding, we're going to have links to some paced bottle feeding videos in the show notes. So check those out. So what else should we be thinking about with formula feeding, Jessica? So how we give the bottle is important.
And then let's talk about how much. So we just talked about, amounts and, per feed, even if once the baby's, a month plus, that those bottle feeds, really 3 to 4, I always say, maybe 4.5, maybe 5 ounces. But to me, a 5 ounce bottle is like, oh, that's a big feed. That kind of would be the outlier. So an average bottle feed, whether this is breast milk or formula, 3, 4 ounces, maybe 4.5, that does not then increase beyond that. So a lot of times people literally don't even know, like, well, wait a minute, is formula ounces the same as breast milk ounces? And in general, yes. Okay. Breast milk varies more in how much it can have calorie per ounce, etc. But the design, formula is designed to be an ounce of formula is the same roughly calories, etc., as an ounce of breast milk. So they're not different numbers. And I think people get really confused about this of like, yes, it's common for formula fed babies to take larger feeds or eat more in a day, but that is more because of the feeding pace and technique that we just talked about. When they're feeding in the biologically appropriate way and paced feeding, they take the same amounts. Like they need the same, roughly the same amount of calories, a little bit of variation baby to baby, but it should be about max intake in a day. And this is when they're 10, 11 pounds more or more. It caps out at 25 to 28 ounces or so per 24 hours.
Right.
So early on, these numbers are smaller. We've got, a week old baby by a week, maybe is taking 2 ounces, but day one, 5 to 10 ml per feed. Day three should be about, let me see, 15 to 30 ml. So about 1 ounce. So the amounts, can get really confusing to people. Kellymom.com is a great resource for this. She's a great page on what to expect, in the first week and the first 6 weeks about amounts like this. So a lot of times people are just getting overfed, like unknowingly being overfed formula is pretty common.
And we would rather have an overfed baby than an underfed baby.
Yeah.
Another thing about that you were talking about with the amounts is I think people don't understand that even though the baby weighs more, the amount doesn't increase because their growth is slowing.
Right. Once they're 10, 11 pounds, it plateaus. The intake should not increase anymore per day. And actually, then once they are eating food, because people are like, well, when does it increase? And we're like, it doesn't.
It doesn't.
And then once they're starting to eat foods and they're getting more and more calories from food, it should decrease slowly because they're getting intake from food and needing less breast milk or formula. As we get to a year and beyond, that decrease should be happening.
Yeah, babies gain about 1 ounce they lose weight for the first 4 days, and then they gain about 1 ounce per 24 hours until about 13, 14 weeks. And then they start gaining half an ounce per 24 hours. And then that drops to a quarter of an ounce. And so even though they're bigger, their growth is slowed, so they need the same amount of calories. Right. And I think that's a message that people just do not understand.
Right. And it's pretty straightforward. It's just, unfortunately, people are not getting this information. So
exactly. So that's what we're here for.
Yeah. So this brings up kind of a little note within this. It is not generally a good idea to mix, like have, a couple ounces of breast milk in a bottle and be adding formula directly to breast milk, like powder, for example, be adding powdered formula directly to breast milk. This, I think, can get really confusing for people. First of all, when you do that, you're changing the hydration ratio. Like we're not like that powder is meant to be added to water so that it's hydrating enough. If we're adding formula to breast milk, now that liquid is going to be less hydrating proportionally, for what's in it. So if you are someone that's using breast milk and formula, let's say we're giving the baby a 4-ounce feed. Okay, we can do this different ways, but one way is maybe we have 2 ounces of breast milk in a bottle and a separate bottle that is just 2 ounces of formula that you made with water. And now those 2 bottles are going to be what that baby gets for that feed. Like that's
why not just mix them, Jessica? So you have
So what people, good question, Barbara. So what people might do is make the 2 ounces of formula, have the 2 ounces of breast milk and combine them in one bottle. The reason we suggest not doing this is when formula is in the bottle, when the baby's mouth touches that bottle, it does need to be, anything left in that bottle needs to be discarded after about an hour. And that if it's just breast milk in the bottle, we don't have to treat it that way. But if it's formula and breast milk, then we do. So now we're going to need to dump out, some precious breast milk, which is how a lot of families think of it. So we can be careful with that. Also, the bottles that formula is in, depending on the age of the baby, but there are much more careful sanitizing and cleaning procedures that need to happen with the bottles or the things that formula is touching compared to breast milk. And that's because breast milk, is not going to grow the same bacteria levels, like the same growth rate, is completely different, formula versus breast milk. So that actually brings me to, a lot of times people are not really told about the full steps, the recommended steps of sanitizing and cleaning and, boiling all the parts and making sure the water that's used for the formula is brought up to boiling and then lowered to a certain temperature. these steps, I'll put the link because it's kind of hard to find. It's surprisingly hard to find this
Yeah.
whole actual procedure that families are supposed to be told about. I will put the link in the show notes. The thing that I do, keep in mind with this and that I tell families about is, a baby that's 2 months or younger, or especially a preemie baby, a medically fragile baby, we might really need to be careful with this when they're younger versus older. And also, that might make pre-made formula bottles. So, you can buy the powder and make it yourself, or you can buy pre-made bottles that are obviously, they are more expensive. So a family's resources is going to come into play here. But those pre-made bottles are what's what I'm looking for? They are sterile. Thank you.
Sterile.
So we don't have to do all of the, boiling and sanitizing and everything when we're using pre-made bottles. So that's something to consider, especially when the baby's like younger than 2 months, to maybe think about. And I'm like hesitant to be like, everyone should be doing this because it is an extra expense. So I'm not saying it's for everybody, but it's something to consider, in those earlier ages versus later.
If you have a baby who's not tolerating powdered formula well, sometimes going to the sterile formula, ready-made, can help that baby too. And I think that there was actually a time where the American Academy of Pediatrics was going to recommend that babies under 3 months only use the sterile ready-made, but the formula companies kicked up such a stink because they knew that if it became more expensive, which the ready-made is more expensive, that it would discourage people from using their product. And yeah, it's tricky because if you look at the World Health Organization, there are very clear steps as to, again, how to clean and sanitize. And then here in the United States, we just wander over to a sink and turn on the water and add it to a bottle of powder and shake it up and give it to a baby.
Right.
And,
many families are doing that. And it's not like no one should ever do that. That's not what we're saying. But I feel like the problem is families aren't even getting informed.
They don't even know.
They don't even have the chance to make the informed choice of what they want to do. Or maybe they want to treat, use formula differently or prepare in these ways differently for a younger baby versus, as they get older. So a lot of families aren't even aware of this. Like no one is telling them this. So we just want to definitely at least share the information.
Another thing that I think that isn't discussed is the option of donor milk available or the risks and benefits of milk sharing. And so a lot of my families, they will have their baby in a hospital that has donor milk even in the hospital. It's not always offered to everybody.
Right.
And so sometimes you have to ask. But that's a question to find out. Which of your hospitals have donor milk available and what are their protocols for using it? And be aware, letting your families know, or if you're a family, finding out what are your rights here. And the milk sharing, people, it's hard because we have not had a documented case of a baby getting sick from shared milk. And believe me, the formula companies would have been all over it if there was one. And people are like, but I don't know that family. And I'm like, but you don't know those cows. You don't know anything about this can of formula that you picked up at the grocery store, who made it, how it was made. And so we're so trusting of the can, but we're so suspicious of another person who wants to share their milk. And so, milk sharing, there are definitely things to do to make it safer. And we have quite a few podcasts on milk sharing. So I'm going to encourage you to check those out. Look for links in the show notes. But yeah, that could be an option too. Maybe we don't need to use formula. Maybe we could use something else.
Yeah. And going back to, if you give birth in the hospital and before you're discharged from the hospital, it may be an option that donated pasteurized milk, if that baby needs something extra, it doesn't have to be formula. And there are risks to using formula. It increases cow milk protein allergy risk, for example, in a way that breast milk does not. So this is something that, again, we feel like families aren't even being told. I mean, it's a family decision, but they at least deserve to be told about these different options, right?
Right. It's
So,
all about informed decision making.
exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. All right.
So we'll wrap up here. Yeah. So basically, I mean, like we said at the beginning, we are not against formula. We do not think any parent is a bad parent for using
Mhm.
formula, whether they need formula, whether they choose to use formula. We completely support, anybody for whatever choice or need they have. Formula marketing is
Mhm.
a problem. Like that
Oh
is
my
a
goodness.
problem. And there's a lot of manipulation and misleading marketing that's going on. But
Yeah.
that being said, I'm very glad formula exists. Like formula needs to exist. It's necessary to have. It's not, excuse me, it's not my job. I think of it as like it's not my job to get a parent to make breast milk as long as possible and as much breast milk as possible. That's not what we think our job is, like get as much breast milk into this baby as possible. We think of it as support this family in whatever they want or need, even if somebody was just going to formula feed. Like we actually
Mhm.
could completely do a consult on that, completely
Yes.
help with that. I always say we kind of should be called infant feeding specialists.
Yep.
People think of lactation consultants as only about the baby's at the breast, from day one on and never, touches formula. But no, we could do a full consult, full support for a family that only was formula feeding, and we'd be very happy to do it. So hopefully this helps. Barbara, anything else we want to add just for these kind of formula
Yeah, we're gonna
formula
put a
feeding?
link. We're gonna put a link to the Lancet 2023 series on breastfeeding
Yeah.
because this is how Jessica and I feel. Formula is just another food, but the formula milk companies exploit parents' emotions and manipulate scientific information to generate sales at the expense of the health and rights of families, women, and children. And that is what we are opposed to.
Yeah, that's a quote
Um,
from the study, right? That we
Yes,
got.
exactly. So we'll have a link there. And yeah, so we are here to help support however you want to feed your baby, however you need to feed your baby.
Yep.
And but there are some things about formula feeding we feel like aren't being shared so that people can make good decisions about the healthiest way to formula feed your baby if you need to use formula.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well,
All
thanks
right.
everybody for listening today.
Yeah, thank you very much.